In 2004, one of the biggest bicycle manufacturers in the world, Shimano, they realized something honestly pretty terrifying about their American market.
Oh, yeah, the adult market data.
Yeah, exactly. 90% of adults were just not riding bikes. Not their bikes, not their competitors' bikes, just, not riding.
Which is a massive problem if you sell bikes.
Right. And if you are a traditional executive looking at that terrifying statistic, your first instinct is probably to, I don't know, run a massive focus group or maybe blast $1 million ad campaign telling people how great biking is.
Or just make the bikes cheaper. Right. That's the usual move.
Exactly. But Shimano did something entirely different. They hired a team who decided the best way to fix the bike was to, completely ignore the gears, the pedals, and the frame.
I mean, it sounds like corporate sabotage when you frame it that way.
I know. But it actually sparked one of the most successful product launches in their history. And that counterintuitive approach is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to this deep dive.
That's going to be a good one.
Definitely. Today, we are on a mission to completely demystify design thinking, using Tim Brown's landmark book, Change by Design. We're going to shatter the premise that design is just about, making things look pretty at the end of a production line.
Right, like picking the paint color.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking at a strategic upstream thought process that solves massive human problems, from healthcare to poverty to the daily friction in your own life. So, for everyone listening, get ready to look at the world completely differently. Okay, let's unpack this.
I really love that we're starting here. And the visual backdrop we have going for this deep dive, this sort of slowly evolving architectural blueprint that's fading into a 19th century railway map, it's actually the perfect anchor.
Or for the Brunel story.
Yeah, because to understand what design thinking is today, we have to travel back to 1841. We need to look at Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the Victorian engineer behind the Great Western Railway in England.
See, when I hear Victorian engineer, I instantly picture a guy covered in soot, aggressively crunching numbers about steel tensile strength in coal combustion.
And, I mean, he certainly did that. But Brunel didn't just want to connect London to Bristol. He was obsessed with the human experience of the journey.
Which is probably awful back then.
Oh, it was. Keep in mind, train travel in the 1840s was terrifying for most people. It was loud, violent, jarring.
Like being in a metal tin can shaking apart.
Exactly. So Brunel didn't just lay tracks. He insisted on engineering the flattest possible gradient across the entire countryside.
Wow, just to make it smoother.
Yes.
What?
He demanded specific types of bridges and viaducts so that the passengers would have the physical sensation of floating.
So he wasn't just optimizing for the fastest route. He was, optimizing for the passenger's nervous system.
Precisely. He even imagined this integrated system where a traveler could board a train at London's Paddington Station and seamlessly step off a steamship in New York.
That is wildly ahead of its time.
It really is. Brunel balanced technical feasibility, commercial viability, and human considerations. Tim Brown actually argues that Brunel was one of the earliest examples of a design thinker because he was designing a human journey, not just solving a math problem.
But the author, Tim Brown, he didn't start his own career with that kind of grand systemic thinking, did he?
No, not at all.
Yeah, because the book details his early days working for Watkin Bursgreen, this venerable English machinery manufacturer. And they brought him in to design circular saws.
Right.
So he spent a summer making these heavy industrial machines look a bit more modern, a bit sleeker. He was basically acting as a link in the chain, taking the finished engineering and dressing it up for the marketing department.
He did exactly what a traditional industrial designer is taught to do. He made the saws aesthetically pleasing. The problem was, Watkin Bursgreen eventually went out of business entirely.
Because a pretty saw doesn't fix a dying industry.
That was his massive realization. The future of the entire woodworking industry in England was in question. As a downstream designer, he was just putting a nice coat of paint on a sinking ship.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
If design remains just a link at the end of the chain, it's completely useless against systemic collapse. Design has to become the hub of the wheel.
The hub, right?
We have to transition from, design with a small d, like those sculptural perfect chairs you see on a museum pedestal, to actually tackling complex foundational problems.
Okay, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because when you talk about moving design upstream to solve foundational problems, I immediately think of corporate research and development. Like R&D labs have existed for decades. They invent things. Is design thinking just a hipster rebranding of traditional R&D?
That's a fair question.
Because it sounds to me like the difference between a pastry chef who just pikes frosting onto a pre-made cake that's downstream design versus a chef who studies what the guests actually crave and invents a new recipe from scratch.
The chef analogy works perfectly, actually. But let's dig into where traditional R&D usually fails compared to that upstream chef.
Okay, how so?
Traditional R&D usually starts with a technological breakthrough. Say the scientists invent a brand new type of flour. Then they hand it to the business team and say, how do we make people want to eat this?
They're working backwards.
Right. They are pushing technology onto the market. Design thinking reverses the polarity. It starts with the human craving, the latent need, and works backward to invent the recipe.
So it's pulling from the human rather than pushing from the tech.
Yes. And understanding why this is necessary requires looking at the broader global economy.
Oh, because of commoditization.
Exactly. Why is a purely technocentric or business-centric view of innovation failing today? Because we are in a massive downward spiral of commoditization. A factory in Shenzhen or Bangalore is reading the exact same management textbooks and using the exact same optimization theories as a company in Silicon Valley.
Wow, yeah, I never thought about it like that.
Optimization naturally leads to sameness. If everyone is just tweaking the supply chain to churn out slightly cheaper, slightly faster versions of the same product, nobody wins except the absolute lowest bidder.
A race to the bottom.
Exactly. We don't need help selecting from existing strategies anymore. We need the creation of entirely new choices.
Okay, that makes sense. The old ways of optimizing are tapped out. So if design thinking is the engine for creating these entirely new choices, how does the engine actually work? Because grand systemic theories are great for a TED Talk. But how do you apply this on a Tuesday morning in a real office?
Right, you need a framework.
Yeah, and the book introduces this concept called the triad of constraints.
Yes, and constraints are really the lifeblood of this entire process. The triad consists of 3 overlapping criteria that any successful idea must balance.
Okay, what are they?
First is feasibility, like is this functionally possible in the near future? Second is viability, can this actually become part of a sustainable business model? And third is desirability, does it fulfill a fundamental human need? Does it make sense to people?
Let's ground this with the Nintendo Wii case study from the book, because this perfectly illustrates what happens when a company completely ignores one part of that triad.
Oh, the Wii is such a classic example.
It really is. Because before the Wii came out, the gaming industry was locked in this vicious, incredibly expensive arms race focused entirely on feasibility.
Microsoft and Sony were just obsessed with computing power. They were chasing faster processors, higher resolution graphics, and incredibly complex controllers.
Yeah, controllers with like 20 buttons.
Exactly. But pushing the bleeding edge of feasibility was making the consoles exponentially more expensive to produce. They were actually selling consoles at a massive financial loss, just hoping to make it up on game sales.
Right, so they were really pushing the limits of viability.
Pushing it to the breaking point.
And entirely ignoring desirability. I mean, they were designing for hardcore gamers, leaving literally everyone else behind. But Nintendo stepped back and looked at the human element. They realized families didn't want to memorize a controller with 14 different buttons.
Nobody wants to read a manual to play a game with their kids.
Exactly. They wanted an immersive, physical, social experience.
So Nintendo made a brilliant strategic trade-off. They intentionally lowered the feasibility requirement. The Wii did not have a bleeding-edge, high-resolution graphics engine. It used older, cheaper processing tech.
Which is wild for a tech company to do.
It is. But they introduced gestural control, the accelerometers, in the Wii remote. Because they weren't subsidizing massive processors, the console was incredibly cheap to produce. It was instantly viable.
And because anyone, like even a grandparent, could understand how to swing a virtual tennis racket, the desirability just went off the charts.
They balanced the triad by actively choosing not to compete on raw technology.
But wait, when we talk about constraints, like choosing to use cheaper processors or having a strict budget, I feel like that goes against everything we were taught about creativity.
So.
Well, if you picture a creative genius, you usually picture a painter standing in front of a massive blank canvas, totally free from all rules. Why does the author argue that a blank canvas is actually a designer's worst nightmare?
Let's look at the psychology of the blank canvas. Have you ever stared at a completely empty Word document and felt totally paralyzed?
Oh, all the time. Writer's block is real.
That's the paradox of choice. Total freedom overwhelms the human brain because there are infinite variables. As the legendary designer Charles Eames pointed out, the mark of a designer is a willing embrace of constraints.
So without constraints, you're not actually designing anything.
Right. Without constraints, you aren't solving a problem, you're just engaging in pure self-expression. That's art. Design is problem solving.
Which is why the fundamental vehicle for design thinking isn't open-ended research. It's the project. Because a project has a start date and an end date.
And those constraints force action. Consider the Innovate or Die contest sponsored by Google and Specialized Bicycles. The directive was to use bicycle technology to change the world.
That is a massive directive.
Huge! But a team of 5 designers won with a creation called the Aqueduct. It's a human-powered tricycle that filters contaminated water while the rider pedals it from the water source back to their village.
And the constraints on that project were brutal. They had to solve a crisis for the 1.1 billion people globally without clean drinking water. But they had zero budget.
None.
They had an inflexible, rapidly approaching deadline. And technologically, it could only be powered by pedaling.
Think about what would happen if you gave a corporate team $10 million in 5 years to solve that.
They'd probably spend 4.5 years debating theories and writing white papers.
Exactly. The severe restrictions of the Aqueduct project forced that small team to stop dreaming and start building. Constraints aren't the enemy of creativity, they are the scaffolding for it.
And that scaffolding is usually established by something called the brief. If the project is the vehicle, the brief is the ignition key, right?
That's a great way to put it.
But crafting a brief seems like a massive tightrope walk. If you make it too tight, you strangle the team. Like the book mentions early fax machines, where the executives essentially handed the designers a finished box of electronics and said, "Here, put a plastic shell in this."
That is the ultimate downstream design brief. It just treats the designer as a decorator. But on the flip side, if a brief is too loose, like, go invent the future of communication, the team drowns in that blank canvas paralysis we just talked about.
Right.
A well-crafted brief acts more like a scientific hypothesis. It provides a framework, but leaves massive room for serendipitous discovery.
Carl Ron, the former head of R&D for home care at Procter & Gamble, gave what Tim Brown considers a masterclass in briefing. P&G didn't go to IDEO and ask for a sponge that was like 2% more absorbent. Ron gave them this exact phrase: reinvent bathroom cleaning for the everyday clean.
Notice what is conspicuously missing from that brief.
Yeah, he didn't specify a product at all.
Exactly. He didn't ask for a chemical, a sponge, a brush, or a wipe. He just identified the human behavior, the quick, everyday wipe down people do in their bathrooms as opposed to the deep weekend scrub.
And because the brief was focused on the human action rather than a specific object, the team generated 350 different product concepts over 12 weeks. They built 60 prototypes. That single perfectly balanced sentence ultimately resulted in the Mr. Clean Magic Reach, which opened up an entirely new revenue stream for the company.
It's incredible. But this introduces a major hurdle. We keep talking about desirability, finding out what humans actually want, like that everyday clean. But how do you actually extract that information from people?
My first thought is, you just ask them. You put 10 people in a room with a two-way mirror, hand them a microphone, and say, "What do you want?"
And that right there is exactly how companies waste millions of dollars.
Wait, really? Just asking them?
Yes, because traditional market research assumes that consumers rationally understand their own needs and can articulate them perfectly, but human psychology just doesn't work that way.
We don't know what we want.
We really don't. We are adaptation machines. We adapt to inconveniences so seamlessly that we become completely blind to them. Henry Ford famously captured this trap. He supposedly said, "If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse."
Because they couldn't conceive of an internal combustion engine. You can't ask people to articulate a latent need, a need they don't even know they have yet. So if you can't ask them, what do?
You observe them. Specifically, you look for what Jane Fulton Surrey calls thoughtless acts.
Oh, I love this concept.
These are the tiny subconscious improvisations we perform every single day to overcome bad design.
Let's ask the listener right now, actually. Think about the absolute mess of computer and charging cables under your desk. Have you ever used a binder clip to hold a phone charger to the edge of the table? Or maybe used a piece of masking tape to label a plug so you don't accidentally turn off your router?
If you've done that, you just performed a design workaround. You fixed a failure of the desk manufacturer.
Right.
But if a market researcher asked you about your desk, you probably wouldn't mention the cables. You'd say, I wish it had nicer wood. You've already solved the cable problem with a binder clip and completely forgotten about it. These thoughtless acts are gold mines. They're visual evidence of unmet needs.
Which brings us right back to the Shimano coasting bike story from the very beginning. Shimano's growth was flatlining in the U.S. If they had relied on traditional focus groups, they would have just surveyed the 10% of people who actually were riding bikes.
And what would those hardcore cyclists have asked for?
Lighter carbon fiber, more aerodynamic helmets, basically faster horses.
Exactly. So instead, IDEO and Shimano fielded an interdisciplinary team, behavioral scientists, marketers, engineers, and designers. And they fanned out to observe the 90% of adults who didn't ride.
And what they uncovered wasn't a lack of interest. It was a massive mountain of latent fear.
Yeah. Think about the last time you walked into an elite independent bike shop. For a casual rider, it's terrifying.
Oh, it is. You walk in, and you are immediately judged by an athlete clad in spandex.
Right. The bikes look like incredibly expensive, fragile machines. They have 30 gears. The seats are rock hard. The maintenance requires specialized tools. The team realized that adults had wonderful, nostalgic memories of riding bikes as kids when it was just about freedom. But as adults, biking had morphed into this intimidating, high-maintenance athletic sport.
Once they understood that psychology, the solution became obvious.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with better gears. They needed to design an experience that stripped away all the intimidation.
Yes. So they invented the concept of coasting.
They designed a bike with an upright handlebar so you aren't hunched over like a racer, puncture-resistant tires so you don't fear a flat, padded seats, no cables snaking everywhere,
Yeah.
and the brakes. You just pedal backward like you did when you were 10 years old.
And the absolute brilliance here is the hidden engineering. The engineering wasn't used to make the bike faster. It was used to make it simpler.
How so?
They put an automatic transmission inside the rear hub that shifts gears for you as you gain speed. The rider doesn't have to think about it at all. Furthermore, they redesigned the entire retail strategy to get these bikes out of those intimidating shops and into more casual environments. And honestly, the most shocking part of this entire process, the traditional role of the designer deciding what the frame actually looked like, the aesthetics was completely deferred to the very end.
That's wild. They figured out the human psychology, the hidden mechanics, and the retail environment before they ever picked up a sketch pad to draw the bike. And it was a massive success. But the source text makes a very careful distinction here between observation and empathy,
Right, that's crucial.
because they watched the non-cyclists.
Eh.
But how do you move from just watching someone to actually having empathy for them?
Well, observation is a cognitive act. You are watching behavior. Empathy is an emotional act. You are trying to actually feel what they feel. This is critical because a 30-year-old, able-bodied male designer cannot simply generalize his own physical experience when trying to design, say, a kitchen gadget for a 70-year-old woman with severe arthritis.
Right. He has to build a bridge of insight.
Yes, exactly.
The story of the SSM DePaul Health Center in St. Louis really drives the empathy point home. They were tasked with redesigning the hospital's emergency room. Now, they could have just stood in the corner with clipboards, charting how long nurses took to walk down a hallway.
But that's just observation. Instead, the designers and the hospital administrators actually got into the emergency room gurneys.
They actually laid down on them.
Yes, they had themselves wheeled through the entire intake process.
Imagine that. You are lying flat on your back. What do you actually see?
You see a blur of acoustic ceiling tiles passing by. You hear alarms you don't understand. You have strange people leaning over you, looking down at you. You are completely stripped of your autonomy.
That sounds terrifying.
It is. Experiencing that terrifying, disorienting vulnerability firsthand is true empathy. It fundamentally shifts how you design the space because you are no longer designing a room for efficiency. You are designing an environment to alleviate panic.
It's the difference between designing for people and designing with people. The user's behavior is the ultimate truth. There is this great anecdote in the book about a travel agent. A design team was researching complex office phone systems. They found this woman who frequently needed to make three-way conference calls. But the multi-line office phone was so impossibly complicated that she invented her own system.
Oh, I love this story.
She would call Judy on the phone on the left side of her desk, call Marvin on a completely separate phone on the right side of a desk, and physically sit between the two receivers so everyone could hear each other.
A traditional software engineer would watch that and scream, "Just read the manual. The phone can do a three-way call. You're using it wrong."
Right. But to a design thinker, the user is never wrong. If the user has to invent a physical workaround because your sackware is too dense, the manual isn't the solution. The manual is proof that the system is broken.
Behaviors are never right or wrong. They are always meaningful. But let's look at the reality of this process for a second. You've spent weeks observing thoughtless acts. You've lain on hospital gurneys. You have thousands of photos, field notes, and sticky notes. Now what?
Yeah, that sounds overwhelming.
It is. This is the moment where most teams completely panic because they are drowning in unstructured qualitative data. How do you process all this humanity without completely losing the plot?
This brings us to the mental matrix of design thinking. And this requires a total rewiring of how most of us are taught to think. Because in school, we are largely taught linear analytical thinking. You take a set of facts, you plug them into a formula, and you converge on the single correct answer.
Like a math test. But design thinking requires you to fluidly shift between 4 distinct mental states: divergent thinking versus convergent thinking, and analysis versus synthesis.
Let's use an analogy here. Let's compare divergence and convergence to breathing.
Okay.
Divergent thinking is the inhale. You're taking everything in, expanding your lungs. The goal isn't to find the right answer. The goal is to multiply options. As Linus Pauling, the Nobel laureate, said, to have a good idea, you must first have lots of ideas.
If you only generate 3 ideas, you're going to end up choosing the safest, most incremental one. Divergence is where you fill the wall with hundreds of wild, impossible ideas. But to use your analogy, you can't just inhale forever. Eventually, you will pass out.
Right. You have to exhale.
That is convergent thinking.
Convergence is the brutal process of making choices. It's evaluating all those Post-it notes against the triad of constraints, feasibility, viability, desirability, and eliminating the weak ones.
It's tough.
The author quotes William Faulkner here, who described the hardest part of writing as having to kill your darlings. It is agonizing to take a brilliant, wildly creative idea and throw it in the trash because it isn't financially viable.
It is agonizing, and it's complicated by office politics. In most corporate brainstorms, convergence happens through the HIPPO effect.
The HIPPO effect.
Yeah, the highest paid person's opinion.
Oh, wow.
Right, the boss just points at an idea and says, we're doing that one, or the loudest extrovert basically bullies everyone into their idea.
But design thinkers have a tool to bypass that, don't they? The book highlights something invented by Bill Moggridge called the butterfly test.
Yes. The mechanics of the butterfly test are brilliant in their simplicity. Imagine that wall covered in hundreds of divergent ideas. Instead of sitting around a table debating them out loud, every team member is handed a few tiny colored sticky notes, the ballots.
Okay.
Everyone walks up to the wall in total silence and sticks their ballots onto the ideas they believe have the most potential.
So within 10 minutes, you can physically see which ideas have attracted a swarm of butterflies.
Exactly. It completely neutralizes the loud, dominant personalities. It synthesizes the group's intuition visually and democratically.
Let's talk about that word synthesis, because the other axis of this matrix is analysis versus synthesis. Analysis is breaking a complex problem down into its component parts, looking at the supply chain, the demographics, the profit margins. But synthesis is different.
Synthesis is the creative act of weaving those raw, fragmented pieces of data into a compelling narrative. Facts alone do not create products. You have to synthesize the fact that, 90% of adults don't ride bikes with the observation of the intimidating bike shop to create the narrative of coasting.
But even with tools like the butterfly test, holding all these competing ideas in your head sounds exhausting. Roger Martin from the Raman School of Management calls this the opposable mind. It's the capacity to hold 2 completely conflicting ideas in tension without panicking. He says you have to embrace the mess.
Which is easier said than done.
Definitely. But I have to ask, if you are constantly embracing the mess and generating hundreds of ideas, how does a team avoid just spinning their wheels forever?
The fixed point on the horizon that forces the transition from divergence to convergence is the deadline. In design thinking, the deadline isn't a punitive measure designed by management to stress you out. The deadline is a functional design tool.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
It is the constraint that forces you to stop inhaling and finally exhale. You just can't synthesize forever.
Because eventually you have to actually build something.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the physical manifestation of all this thinking, the culture of prototyping. And the philosophy here completely shatters how most corporations view product development.
Absolutely. In traditional business, a prototype is seen as the final step. You spend a year writing a 200-page specification document, you finalize the budget, and then you build a flawless, highly polished prototype right before mass production to prove that it works.
But design thinking treats the prototype as the very first step. David Kelly calls it thinking with your hands. The goal is not to make something flawless. The goal is to build something just barely functional enough to reveal its own flaws. The mantra in the book is, fail early to succeed sooner.
Think about the financial risk. If you spend 18 months and $5 million perfecting a polished prototype, and then you put it in front of a consumer who says, I hate this, you have just burned $5 million.
Massive sunk costs.
Exactly. But if you spend 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon building a rough mock-up out of cardboard, foam core, and masking tape, and the user hates it, you've lost nothing. You learn immediately what doesn't work, and you pivot on Wednesday morning.
I get how you can build a cardboard washing machine or a foam core medical device, but we are moving into a service economy. How do you prototype something you can't touch? If my company's designing a new online pharmacy or a new check-in process for an airline, I can't build that out of cardboard.
That's where you borrow techniques from Hollywood. You prototype invisible services using scenarios and storyboards. You invent a highly specific fictional persona.
Like a character in the movie.
Exactly. Let's say a divorced professional mother with 2 toddlers who works night shifts. You map out a completely believable narrative of her daily routine. When exactly is she trying to use your online pharmacy? What is her emotional state at 2 a.m. when the baby is crying and the app won't load? Writing that script and walking through it step by step is a form of prototyping. It forces the abstract service to confront human reality.
And some companies take this to incredible extremes in the digital world. The book tells a fascinating story about Starwood Hotels. They were preparing to launch a completely new hotel brand called Aloft. Now, building a physical hotel to see if people like the lobby is a $100 million gamble.
You can't just build a hotel as a test.
Right. So they didn't. They built a 3D virtual prototype of the hotel inside the video game Second Life.
It's one of the most brilliant examples of prototyping in the wild. They didn't just build a digital rendering, they invited real players' avatars to come inside and explore the virtual hotel, and they watched how people interacted with the space.
And the feedback was incredibly specific. The avatars complained that they wanted radios in the showers. They felt the color scheme was too cold, so they requested earth tones in the lobby.
So Starwood actually shut down the virtual hotel, renovated it based on the feedback, repainted the digital walls, and reopened it. They even threw a cyber party for the avatars to celebrate.
That is so cool.
They learned how social dynamics would play out in their lobby spaces before they had poured a single ounce of actual concrete.
That is just brilliant risk mitigation. IDEO even applied this logic to their own corporate structure. They realized their traditional structure wasn't working as they expanded globally, so instead of hiring a massive consulting firm to reorganize them, they prototyped their own org chart. They treated the company structure as a flexible experiment, setting up global practices focused on themes like health, just to see if the structure held water.
It reveals the great paradox of prototyping. It slows you down to speed you up.
Right.
Taking the time to build cardboard models, run scenarios, or build virtual hotels feels inefficient at the beginning. But the learning you extract from those early failures accelerates the back half of the project exponentially because you aren't backtracking to fix systemic errors.
Okay, here's my massive objection, though. What you are describing sounds fun and creative. But let's talk about the listener who works in a Fortune 500 company, or a rigid government agency, or a hospital. Most traditional corporate cultures actively punish failure. They do not want to see a cardboard washing machine held together by duct tape.
They want a polished PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, they want a Gantt chart and a milestone report showing everything is perfect.
Yeah.
How does a mid-level employee actually pivot to this messy prototyping culture without getting fired for wasting time?
That is the ultimate bottleneck. Design thinking just cannot survive in an environment that penalizes risk. To foster this, an organization has to radically rethink its teams and its spaces. And it starts with hiring and empowering what McKinsey calls T-shaped individuals.
Let's break down the geometry of the T-shape. What does the vertical stroke represent?
The vertical stroke is deep, undeniable technical expertise. You need people who are absolute masters of their specific craft. A brilliant mechanical engineer, a world-class ethnographer, a master graphic designer. But deep expertise alone creates silos. That's where the horizontal stroke of the T comes in.
The horizontal stroke is the disposition for cross-disciplinary collaboration, right? It's the empathy to understand what the person in the other department actually does.
Yes. It's the engineer understanding the value of the marketer's insight and vice versa. When you have T-shaped people, you can move from a multidisciplinary team to an interdisciplinary team.
That distinction is so critical in the book. A multidisciplinary team is basically a hostage negotiation. The engineer, the designer, and the finance person all sit at a table, but they are guarding their own turf.
Right, they're defending their territory.
Yeah, the engineer fights to make it easier to build,
Yeah.
the finance person fights to cut the budget, and they eventually hammer out a gray, watered-down compromise that nobody actually likes.
Exactly, but an interdisciplinary team operates on collective ownership. The finance person actually takes ownership of the design, and the designer takes ownership of the budget. They are synthesizing their expertise, not defending it.
And once you have these interdisciplinary T-shaped teams, where do you put them? A lot of tech companies just throw a ping pong table and some beanbag chairs into a glass office and declare, we have an innovative culture.
Beanbag chairs are just aesthetic emblems. Real innovation requires a psychological space that forgives failure. But physical space does matter if it breaks the corporate routine.
Like the Mattel example.
Right. The book highlights Mattel's platypus experiment. Ivy Ross, who was running Girls Products, saw that her teams were paralyzed by standard corporate silos. So she created a dedicated skunkworks project. She pulled people out of their regular jobs, finance, engineering, design, and put them in a completely separate physical space for a 12-week boot camp.
They weren't just dropping in for a 1-hour brainstorm on Tuesdays. They lived in that project room. P&G did the exact same thing with the Clay Street project. They literally rented an off-site loft in downtown Cincinnati so teams could physically escape the oppressive day-to-day rules of the corporate headquarters.
It creates a microculture where the old rules just don't apply. Also, notice the size of these groups. Inspiration and radical ideation require small teams. Massive armies of employees are only useful at the very end of the process, during implementation.
But coming back to the listener trapped in the gray cubicle with the rigid boss, if they can't rent a downtown loft, what is their move?
The move is start small and protect the prototype. Don't go to your boss and ask for permission to change the entire corporate culture. Find a small, low-stakes problem. Grab 2 T-shaped colleagues. Build a rapid, ugly prototype of a solution and then show it to your boss.
Oh, instead of pitching it.
Yes, a physical prototype or a mapped-out scenario bypasses bureaucratic resistance because it makes the idea tangible. Show, don't tell.
Because seeing is believing. And what we are designing and showing them today is wildly different than it was 20 years ago. We are no longer just designing heavy machinery or plastic sax machines. We are deep into the era of experience engineering.
Experience engineering recognizes that design doesn't just exist in 3 dimensions. It exists in the 4th dimension, which is time. An experience unfolds chronologically.
Right.
Every single touch point, from the moment a customer sees an ad, to the unboxing, to the customer service call 3 years later, must be choreographed.
The Bank of America Keep the Change program is a stunning case study in experience engineering. BOFA came to IEO with a very standard banking problem. They wanted to increase the number of checking and savings accounts.
Which is a classic marketing problem.
Right. The traditional financial solution would be to tweak the interest rates by 0.5% and run a marketing campaign.
But the design team didn't look at spreadsheets. They went into the field. They went to Baltimore, Atlanta, and San Francisco, and they watched how real people managed their household finances.
And they observed a massive psychological barrier. People felt incredibly guilty that they couldn't manage to save large, dedicated chunks of money at the end of the month.
But they also observed a thoughtless act. When people were writing checks to pay bills or balancing their checkbooks, they were artificially rounding up the numbers just to make the math easier.
Oh, like if a coffee was $3.50, they wrote down $4.
The designers synthesized those 2 observations. You cannot easily force humans to adopt a totally new, difficult behavior like saving 10% of their income. But what if you build a system on top of a behavior they are already doing?
Thus, Keep the Change was born. Every time you buy that $3.50 coffee with your debit card, the bank automatically rounds the charge up to $4 and transfers that extra 50 cents directly into your savings account.
It removed the friction of saving. It engineered an experience that turned a daily chore into a tiny moment of financial victory. It was a staggering success, attracting millions of new customers, all built on top of a pre-existing human habit.
And the brilliance of a well-engineered experience is that it turns your customers into storytellers. A great design doesn't just blast a marketing message at you. It gives you a story that you actively want to participate in. Best Buy realized this with their Wolfpack initiative, the Women's Leadership Forum.
Best Buy historically was a store built by men, for men. It was focused on gigahertz, massive subwoofers, and technical specs. But the data showed that women were influencing or directly making nearly half of the purchases.
Which is a huge market to ignore.
Massive. So Best Buy empowered these wolf packs, small groups of employees, to redesign the retail experience from the ground up.
And they didn't just paint the walls pink. They completely re-engineered the physical environment. They realized the aisles were too narrow for strollers, so they widened them. They realized staring at a wall of black TVs was intimidating, so they built living room mock-ups to help customers visualize the tech in their own homes.
They also redesigned the interaction script. They trained the staff to stop bombarding people with technical jargon and start asking them about their lifestyles. What kind of movies does your family watch? Or where does the sun hit your living room?
That's completely different.
They transformed the store from a warehouse of electronics into an interactive story. As a result, female employee turnover plummeted, and they captured a massive new segment of the market.
It really is like a movie. It feels like designers used to just be the graphic artists who painted the movie poster. But now, with experience engineering, they are writing the screenplay, they are directing the actors, and they are designing the acoustics in the theater.
That is the perfect analogy. The designer is the architect of the entire temporal journey.
So if design thinking is powerful enough to manipulate a banking system or revolutionize a massive retail chain, I have to ask the ultimate question. Can it fix the world? Because the book concludes with this shift toward design activism and the new social contract.
As we transition into a fully interconnected service economy, the boundary between the consumer and the citizen kind of dissolves. We are realizing that the most ambitious designers aren't satisfied just designing better cell phones. They are aiming the triad of constraints at systemic global challenges.
This is the realm of social entrepreneurship. Jacqueline Novogratz and the Acumen Fund are prime examples. Acumen evaluates its investments in East Africa and South Asia not as charity, but through the lens of feasibility, viability, and desirability.
They demand a balance.
Yeah, the book details organizations like Aravind Eye Care in India, or IDE, which designs irrigation tools for subsistence farmers. They aren't just dropping free, poorly designed water pumps into a village and walking away.
They are designing affordable products that create wealth for the poorest populations, and they are building sustainable business models around them. They are designing empowerment.
The same logic applies to the climate crisis. For a century, our industrial model has been based on heat, beat, and treat. It's a muscular, incredibly wasteful process of extracting resources, burning them, and throwing away the toxic byproducts.
The new era of design activism requires closing the loop. It requires biomimicry, looking at nature where there is no concept of waste. In nature, the waste of one system is the food for another.
But the data around climate change is so overwhelming. How does a designer actually engage with that? Chris Lubkeman at the engineering firm Arup came up with a brilliant synthesis tool. He created the drivers of change cards. Because if you drop a 500-page UN climate report on a CEO's desk, they will never read it.
It's just too much data. It causes paralysis. So Lubkeman took that complex data and visualized it onto single, easily adjustable playing cards. One card might just ask, how important are trees, and visually break down carbon sequestration.
That's amazing.
It takes terrifying global data and makes it accessible enough to prompt actual problem solving in a workshop.
It all comes back to human behavior. When the U.S. Department of Energy wanted to promote energy efficiency, their old assumption was just fund R&D for better technology, because people already care about the environment. They just need the gadgets.
But a program called Shift Focus utilized design thinking to challenge that assumption.
Because the assumption was wrong.
Right. They stopped looking at the technology and started investigating the human behavior. Why aren't people using the efficient tech we already have? What are the behavioral roadblocks? They realized you can't just engineer a better light bulb. You have to design a system that makes the user actively want to screw it in.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I hear all of this, but is it really the designer's job to solve poverty or healthcare or the climate crisis? Shouldn't these massive systemic issues be left to the actual experts, the politicians, the macroeconomists, the climate scientists?
It is a totally valid critique. But the reality is that the crises we face today are too tangled for any single discipline to solve in isolation. Politicians understand the levers of policy. Economists understand market incentives. Scientists understand the raw physics of carbon.
But they don't always talk to each other.
Exactly. Who synthesizes all of that into something a human being will actually interact with? Design thinkers are the synthesizers. They don't replace the scientists. They provide the scaffolding to make the scientific solutions desirable and viable for everyday people. We can no longer treat citizens as passive end users. A new social contract requires treating them as active co-participants.
Let's synthesize everything we've explored today. We have traced a massive evolution in how we solve problems. We started with Isambard Kingdom Brunel making train passengers feel like they were floating, and we ended up building virtual hotels in Second Life and engineering savings accounts.
It's been a wild ride.
We have learned that design is no longer just putting frosting on a cake. It is the upstream strategic process of building entirely new systems. It demands that we balance feasibility, viability, and desirability.
And it requires us to abandon focus groups, embrace empathy, lay on hospital gurneys, survive the messy divergence of brainstorming, and ultimately be willing to fail early by building rough prototypes.
And the most empowering takeaway from Tim Brown's work is that this is not a mystical talent restricted to people with fine arts degrees. Design thinking is a methodology. The tools are accessible to anyone willing to embrace constraints.
Which means you, the listener, can apply this framework to your own life right now. Think about it. Your life is a prototype. Do not try to plan out your career or your life perfectly from day one like some rigid corporate milestone report.
Conduct experiments. Build rough, low-stakes prototypes of the life you want to live.
Look for the supernormal in your environment. Look at the things you interact with every day and ask why with the relentless curiosity of a 5-year-old. Why are manhole covers round? Why do you automatically know how much space to leave between you and the person in front of you at the grocery store?
Start keeping a visual notebook. Notice the thoughtless acts you perform every day. Because life is completely iterative. It is a constant process of creation, observation, and recreation. So we want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the ultimate goal of design thinking is to transition us from being mindless consumers into active, meaningful creators, look around the room you are sitting in right now. Think back to that perfectly aesthetic chair sitting in the broken, chaotic hospital waiting room. What is one system, one daily habit, or one thoughtless act in your own life that you have simply accepted as normal but that is actually fundamentally broken? And how could you completely redesign it by tomorrow?
That's a great question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you next time.